This week's Torah reading, Parshat Behar, flips a lot of ideas that we normally hold on to 180 degrees. And so I'm titling this class, Seeing or Believing. Because we know in the course of human events, there are people who are keen observers and who have a lot of insight into what's going on around them. And yet they completely misread and misunderstand the events are happening. And sometimes better than good eyesight will be a sense of grounding and belief. So I want to begin the class by looking at Psalm 132. And it reads like this. I'm going to pick up just the last few sentences, sentence 11 to 18. I'm going to read it in English, according to this translation of the Psalms that speak to you. And it goes as follows. God made a solemn promise to David. He will not go back on it. Your descendants will be the ones I will place upon your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and the practices that I teach them, their sons too will sit on your throne forever. For God has chosen Zion, Zion. He desires it as his home, saying, this is my eternal residence. I desired it, and here I will dwell. I will greatly bless its food, satisfy its needy with bread. I will clothe its priests with salvations. Its pious ones will sing loudly with joy. There I will make David's strength flourish. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. I will clothe his enemies with shame. On him, his crown will shine. So this is a vision. It's a vision in the form of a promise. But the vision has to do with us, the Jewish people, living in the land that's the very land that God desires most. And I, at times, have asked kids, I said, is it possible for God to desire something? Now, if you think about it, desire is a product of not being able to control or wanting something you can't have or are unable to have. And how does that apply to God? And in fact, the word in Hebrew, and we include it in the daily prayers, it says, Ki Behar Hashem b'Tzion, God has chosen Zion, Iva l'moshavlo. He desires it as his home. Now, we know that for the last 2,000 years, God has been living in a lot of places, primarily not in the land of Israel. And, that balance is shifting probably for the first time in almost 2,000 years, where according to some counts, the majority of the Jewish people in the world live in the land of Israel. But what does it mean for God to desire to live someplace? So the answer is that because God only wants to live there together with us, the Jewish people. That's a very amazing concept to try to envision. Where does God live? God lives everywhere, we tell our kids. Up, down, here, and there. The Kutzker Rebbe, God lives wherever we human beings let God in. But in a profound way, God says, I have a place I want to live in. It's the land of Israel, it's Zion. If only you would join me and live in the land. So hence, we're yearning for redemption and yearning for the opportunity to dwell securely at peace in our homeland under the protection of Hashem. Hashem is yearning for it also. Why doesn't it happen? A profound question. The Torah's answer is because, as the Torah states in two particular instances, when there's immorality, sexual immorality, the land of Israel can't tolerate that. And that's why it spit out the nations that inhabited the land during the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's why we were able to come into the land and make it our own, because we were pledged to live on a higher plane, on a plane that would be in consonance with the sensitivity, so to speak, of the land itself. A second factor, the beginning of this week's Torah reading in Behar, Shemitah. The land, as the Torah states, demands its rest. every 7 days. I used to think sometimes in a humorous way, if you had a family that observed Shabbat and turned off their TV every Shabbos, I thought of this as a kid, and everybody else's TV would all of a sudden go on the blink and stop working every week. So it'd be pretty clear that, having a TV is a really neat thing. As a little kid, it's one of the most important things you could imagine having in your world. And it needs to rest though on Shabbos. It needs to rest, so to speak. That's the concept here of the land. And so we begin the Parsha Behar with this unusual commandment that it's hard to wrap our heads around, but there's 7 days in the week. The seventh day is Shabbat, where the Torah tells us to rest, to commune to God, to make it a day like the next world, so to speak, a day where we're not distracted from focused on a relationship with Hashem. The seventh month of the year is the month of Tishrei. It's the month we're filled with Yomim Tovim, with days that we're not supposed to, with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and all those days of holiday. Why? Again, it's the seventh month of the year. And then you count 7 years. And the land needs to rest. The land says, you want to live here, so to speak? Fine. Do something else for a year. Occupy yourself with something else. Be impractical for a year. Be as spiritually oriented as you can possibly withstand. And don't let the need to till the soil and to provide food for yourself distract you. And then you count 7 cycles of 7 years. And lo and behold, you have Yovel. Yovel already, where you're going to go through 2 straight years. Your 49th year is a sabbatical year. So the economy is on hold, so to speak. You don't own anything. You feel ownerless. And as I've described before in these classes, I have a beautiful orchard, or I have now vineyards are popping up all over Israel. And I pick my grapes for 6 years and I taste them and I'm worried about them and I'm nurturing them so I can get a certain flavor and a certain taste. And then along comes the 7th year. And anybody who wants to, I have to wait in line to pick the grapes off the branches, because anybody who gets there before me, they have as much right to them as I do. And then when you think of 7 cycles of 7 years, and then comes the 50th year. And in the 50th year, even lands that have been purchased return back to the original owner, and nothing has worked. And all this leads to a crescendo of the Torah sanctioning a question of faith. And that question comes up very dramatically comes up very dramatically. I'm sorry, I didn't write down the sentence number here. 1 second. Because the Torah says there'll be a Jubilee year. And you're going to ask a question. You're going to say, how can we possibly make it through this? It's sentence 19. The land will give its fruit, and you will eat your fill, and you will dwell slowly upon it. Sentence 20 in chapter 25. If you will say, what will we eat in the 7th year? Behold, we will not sow and not gather in our crops. I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, and it will yield a crop sufficient for the 3-year period. Because we're talking about in the 48th year is when you're most likely to freak out, because even though you've gone through 6 cycles of Shemitah and somehow you've managed to survive, when you're in the 48th year and you're gathering in your crop, it occurs to you, no planting next year. The year after that is going to be Yovel, no planting that year. As I pick these grapes off the vine, as I harvest my wheat, I'm thinking to myself, it's not going to be until another 3 years that I'm going to be planting again. How can we possibly make it? And the Torah sanctions that. So what does God say? We'll ask, what are we going to eat? I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, and it will yield a crop sufficient for the 3-year period. You will sow in the 8th year, but you will eat from the old crop until the 9th year, until the arrival of its crop you will eat the old. So the Torah here is making an allowance, seemingly, for the unbeliever, for the non-believer, for the skeptic, for the person who's not willing to accept the Torah at face value. And after all, as I always mention, I could ask this about any mitzvah. Give tzedakah. Well, what's going to be in my old age? Maybe I won't have enough money to live off of. Keep kosher. Well, kosher food's more expensive, harder to find. Maybe I'll be hungry. You can panic over any of the 613 mitzvot, the positive ones and the negative ones. How many people haven't thought to themselves, gee, all these Jewish holidays, what's going to be with my business by the time Sukkot is over? The Torah doesn't sanction these kind of questions, but all of a sudden here it does. And then the real kicker is, it seems to be saying in the Torah that it's the one who says, what am I going to eat? The one who panics, the one who, in spite of the fact that he made it through 6 cycles of Shemitah already, but this 3-year lapse is daunting to him. This person says, what am I going to eat? So the Torah says, okay, I have a bracha for you. Now, what all the commentaries are bemused about is the following question. That's who you're going to give the bracha to? What about the guy who sits quiet? What about the guy who picks his crops in the sixth year, and in this case, the 48th year, and he's not worried, and he's calm, and he and his wife look at their silo and say, this will do for us. So they don't get a bracha. God doesn't come to them and say, oh, look at this trust. Look at this sense of security. Look at the fact that this person surrenders their initiative to the dictates of the Torah. That's who should get the blessing. That's who God should come to and offer a blessing to. And God should appear to that person and say, wow, thank you very much for trusting in me. Please understand that although the skeptic may say your food looks like it won't make it, you're going to be fine. Why does God come to the skeptic and the one who's panicking? And the answers that are given are very interesting. And they have a range to them, and they're all important for us to think about, and to think about in our own daily lives as we each make calculations, as we do instantaneously throughout the day and throughout every minute of our lives. Are we better off? Are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Are we better off than we were 4 minutes ago? Whatever time frame we want to wrap our heads around, we're constantly assessing that literally from the time we enter into the world. One commentary says that the implicit promise to the person who's not worried is, even if you have very little grain, a miracle is going to happen. That little bit is going to satisfy you, and you're going to be satiated, and you're going to have no problems. And you're going to sit down and you're going to have a big breakfast table set for yourself, and you're going to take 1 or 2 bites, and you're going to say, oh, this food is delicious. I feel satisfied. I feel happy. This is the best meal I've ever had in my life. And I'm going to get up from the table and I'll say, let's save the rest for lunch. And then let's save the rest for dinner. And then lo and behold, that 49th year and that 50th year, and even that first year of the new cycle where things are just being planted is just going to run through. And the whole time I'm going to be walking around thinking to myself, I've never felt such a sense of well-being, of health, of wellness, of satisfaction as I have until now. That's the real bracha that finds itself throughout the entire system of the Torah. It's a bracha that you don't see as readily. And then, of course, what's the flip side? So the person who's panicking and comes to God, so to speak, and says, okay, God, it's I finished my harvest. It doesn't look good. I only have 14,000 pounds of potatoes. I usually use 7,000 a year. So maybe I'll make it through next year. Maybe I'll even make it through the following year. But, then there's going to be that gap in the future. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? So God says, you know what? Okay, I'll give you 30,000 pounds of potatoes. But of course, what does that mean? You're going to have to harvest them, and you're going to have to store them, and you're going to have to carry them around, and then your wife's going to have to cook them. So whereas the other person who stayed calm and who saw the reality of the situation, but laced that vision with trust and belief in God, has a much more relaxed 3 years, a much more spiritual experience, a much more satisfied experience. And the other person says, wow, look at this, the 48th year, all of a sudden I've got potatoes coming out of my ear. I'm going to have to buy a new silo, and we're going to have to hire more workers, and we're going to have to box these up. And, but we have enough, so we will never go a Shabbos without a potato cookle. Yes, that's all true. But who's better off? Who is it that's living in the land as God meant for us to live in the land? Who is it that's really benefiting from everything that the land has to offer? And that's where the idea of what you see in combination with what you believe, the level in which you trust in God, the level in which you're willing to surrender, which is what faith and trust really is all about. Not surrender in a stupid way, in the sense that I am taking no responsibility for my life, no, but in the sense that I'm going back to Psalm 132 and I'm joining with God. God really loves living in the land of Israel together with me. And living in the land of Israel means a few things. Number one, it means a high moral plane is demanded of me, because the land itself and proximity to God requires me to live up to a certain standard. And second of all, it demands of me a certain disposition of calmness, and a sense that I place my future in the hands of God, just as I do every night when I go to sleep. Biyado afkid ruchi. And that gives me a sense of security, and that gives me a sense of calm. And I think this all points in the direction of understanding something that's a little mysterious in Pirkei Avot. It says that who is wealthy? A person who is happy in his lot. Hasameach bechelko. Now, I don't think we would say who is, I'm sorry, Ezehu Oshir, who is wealthy, a person who's happy in his lot. I would amend that Pirkei Avot, like who's happy. I understand that there are people with less who are happier and more content and more satisfied than people with a lot. We all know that. That's what the tabloids make their living showing us. So why doesn't it say in Pirkei Avos, Ezehu Sameach? Who is it that's a happy person? Who's a content person? Who's a calm person? Who is a person who is managing anxiety well, to use a modern idiom? A person who feels a contentment with what they've achieved and feels secure in what they have. But that's not the language. Who's a wealthy person? Ezehu Oshir. So the Torah is telling us, take your dictionary, and when you see the word wealthy, put in the word content, happy. Change your paradigm. Think of it differently. Literally reprogram your way of thinking. And then as you look around the world in your every moment assessment of, am I better off or am I worse off? Am I going to survive this or am I not going to survive this? Is this fair or is it not fair? If you lace that perception with an element of seeing and believing, rather than believing what I seem to be seeing, that's a game changer. And I'll just say how this plays out in the Pesach story also. Interestingly, when the Haggadah retells the story, when we sit at Pesach night and we retell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and by the way, tonight begins Pesach Sheni, the second echo of Pesach, where those people who couldn't bring the Paschal lamb at the time of when Pesach fell, they have a special holiday where they're actually offering the lamb up right now this afternoon on the 14th of ER, and then they're going to sit down at night on the 15th and have their Pesach Seder because they weren't able to fulfill that mitzvah for reasons of purity and ritual purity a month ago. When the Haggadah tells the story, it says something interesting. It says the Jewish people saw that Pharaoh died. They saw a new Pharaoh come to power, and they cried out to God, and God heard their cry. And that sets into motion the redemption of the Jewish people. And then what happens? Moshe, walking calmly with his sheep hundreds of miles away in Midian, encounters the burning bush. And as they say, the rest is history. The rest is the redemption of the Jewish people. So Rav Hirsch and other commentaries explain that the Jewish people were in an impossible, terrible situation of oppression. But they thought to themselves, oh, this Pharaoh, he's a human being. He's going to die. How long could he live? And when he dies, a new Pharaoh will take over. And, we have political organizations, we have lobbyists, we have advocates in the capital. Somehow that'll better our position. So, we don't have the same yearning for God's intervention. But once they saw a new Pharaoh arise, and once they saw that the oppression continued unabated, that's when they started seeing things differently and realizing it's not going to be so much about how effective our lobbyists are to impact the government decisions. Sure, when we have an opportunity to impact government decisions and to vote and to be participating, we should do that. But ultimately, it all comes down to the level of our relationship with God and the extent to which we can place our trust in him. And by the Jewish people coming to that conclusion, a belief-based conclusion, and realizing that their only real hope for getting out of here, getting out of Egypt, was for them to really turn to God and to really use their power of prayer and to call out to God and say, God, we've had enough. We've had enough. And yes, we're going to do what we can to defend ourselves in every way we can. But ultimately, we're looking for you to open up the book of Psalms, turn to chapter 132, and to please remind yourself of this idyllic vision of descendants of David in their greatness sitting on a throne, and the Jewish people responding and living in consonance with the vision that God has. That makes us happy. It gives us a sense that redemption is at hand, and it makes God happy also, because God also is desiring of returning to Zion and living there with us and watching over us and seeing us flourish and seeing us live in security and seeing us all be rich, not rich because we'll have the highest GDP in the world, but rich in the sense of a level of contentment and a sense of happiness and a sense of fulfillment, which ultimately the Parsha of Behar is telling us requires us to see things differently than the norm, and to not just say what you see is what you get, but to understand is what you believe in will change your perception and give you a clarity of vision that will enable you to unlock a level of contentment, of wealth, of happiness, and an opportunity to dwell and fulfill all the visions that the Torah holds out for us and for mankind. Because that fulfillment of that vision will include every human being who will remain on earth. May it happen speedily in our days.